what can Seoul do to help Pyongyang and Washington find the middle ground? We'll have an expert in the studio later for some answers. But first, let's turn to Devin Whiting at Arirang's News Center for a look at the day's headlines. Devin.
Hi, Minji. A new sign the U.S. might be adjusting its stance on North Korea's human rights abuses. The U.S. has taken out a word describing the regime's human rights violations in its latest report. Lee Seung-jae tells us more.
Egregious, meaning outstandingly bad or shocking. It's a word previously used to describe North Korea's human rights abuses. However, in the U.S. State Department's annual country reports on human rights practices, the word egregious was removed in describing the North's human rights violations. The report also made no mention of the regime in its preface, whereas in the previous year, the North was labeled among forces of instability, along with China, Russia, and Iran. However, the 29-page section on North Korea still revealed a long list of human rights violations. Such violations included unlawful or arbitrary killings by the government, forced disappearances by the government, and torture by government authorities. The list covered arbitrary detentions by security forces, detention centers, and political prison camps, where conditions were often harsh and life-threatening. It also mentioned severe restrictions of religious freedom, coerced abortion, and human trafficking. At a press briefing on Wednesday, the U.S. State Department's Ambassador for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Michael Kozak, says there hasn't been much progress in North Korea when it comes to the area of human rights. He added it's still one of the worst human rights situations in the world, and the U.S. will continue to work to persuade the regime to change its behavior. North Korea has rejected accusations of human rights abuses, calling it a U.S.-led attempt to topple the regime. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Top U.S. diplomats are holding back-to-back meetings with key UN officials to discuss the sanctions on North Korea. Washington's Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, is traveling to New York on Thursday to meet with the UN Security Council and its key permanent representatives. The U.S. State Department says Biegun will discuss the recent North Korea-U.S. summit and efforts to ensure the full implementation of UN resolutions until North Korea's final and fully verified denuclearization. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, meanwhile, met with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Wednesday to talk about the denuclearization issue. These meetings come after a UN panel report revealed that North Korea is still violating UN sanctions and illegally buying petroleum and selling coal. No new activity at North Korea's Sohae satellite launching station in Dongchangni. This is according to North Korea monitoring website 38 North. It said Wednesday that a satellite picture taken on March 8th indicates that construction on the engine support structure observed over the past few weeks has been completed. Also rebuilt is a rail-mounted environmental shelter that conceals the transfer of rocket engines. Construction materials and debris have been removed from the site. Another image from March 13th shows that the site remains pretty much the same. A vehicle is parked at the observation building and another few at the Security Administration building near the main entrance of the launch site. South Korea and the U.S. have been scaling down their joint military drills to make room for diplomacy, a move that's caused concern in some quarters. But the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, General Robert Abrams, has dismissed those worries. In an interview with Yonhap News Agency on Wednesday, Abrams said the ROK-U.S. military alliance is absolutely committed to ensuring that it's ready to deal with any crisis or potential hostilities. And to support the ongoing peace efforts with Pyongyang, he said Seoul and Washington would no longer publicize their military exercises like they did in the past. As for American troops stationed in South Korea, he said they have nothing to do with any potential peace treaty with North Korea in the future, and that their presence is solely an alliance decision. In other news, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is en route to Cambodia, the last stop of his three-nation tour to the ASEAN region. Before leaving for Phnom Penh, President Moon wrapped up his schedule in Malaysia with a business forum, where an entourage of business leaders from Seoul thrashed out some deals with local firms. And after landing in Cambodia, the president will meet with South Koreans living in the country and wrap up his one-week three-nation tour on Saturday. Senior diplomats from South Korea and Japan met in Seoul this afternoon to discuss issues that are negatively affecting their relations, following up on a meeting in Tokyo last month. Director General for Northeast Asian Affairs Kim Yong-gil discussed the issues with his Japanese counterpart Kenji Kanasugi. They're expected to have talked about South Korea's court rulings that ordered Japanese companies to compensate Koreans for their unpaid labor during World War II. The meeting comes amid reports that Japan is considering raising tariffs on South Korean imports and bringing the case to the International Court of Justice after Seoul did not respond to demands for an intergovernmental discussion on the matter. Government data show the trade volume between Korea and the U.S. hit a record high last year. Ko Eun-hee explains.
It's been 7 years since Seoul and Washington's free trade deal came into force. And according to Korea's Trade Ministry on Thursday, the trade volume between the two sides last year hit a record high of around $131.6 billion US dollars. This is an increase of more than 10% compared to the previous year, and the trade volume has been increasing for 2 consecutive years. Korea's exports to the U.S. rose by 6% in 2018 thanks to more outbound shipments of semiconductors and petroleum goods. Chip exports jumped by more than 90% thanks to more investment from data centers boosting demand for semiconductors. In terms of petroleum goods, the ministry attributes the trend to the increase in international oil prices. However, auto exports decreased by almost 7% due to an increase in competition in the U.S. market. Korea's imports from the U.S. also grew by more than 16%, mainly due to more inbound shipments of liquefied petroleum gas and natural gas. LPG shipments from the U.S. increased by more than 50% compared to the previous year. The ministry attributed the rise in shipments from the U.S. to cheaper prices compared to other regions like the Middle East. Because of the increase in imports, the amount of trade surplus decreased compared to the previous year. The ministry added that the effect of the revised Seoul-Washington Free Trade Agreement, which took force in January, will be reflected in next year's data. Ko Eun-hee, Arirang News.
After the crash last weekend of Boeing's new 737 MAX passenger jet, dozens of countries have banned the plane from the skies. Now the planes are believed to have been grounded worldwide after the United States decided to follow suit. Hong Yu has the details.
We're going to be issuing an emergency order of prohibition to ground all flights of the 737 MAX 8 and the 737 MAX 9 and planes associated with that line.
On Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump decided to ground all Boeing 737 MAX jets in the country because of safety concerns after the same model crashed twice in a 5-month period. Last weekend, the 737 MAX jet, operated by Ethiopian Airlines, crashed shortly after takeoff, killing all 157 people on board. A 737 MAX operated by Lion Airplane smashed into the Java Sea last October, killing 189 people. As concerns over the safety of the aircraft reached fever pitch in the U.S., President Trump overrode the Federal Aviation Administration, the U.S. airline industry, and even the CEO of Boeing, who personally reached out to Trump to try and convince him the planes are safe. The FAA earlier said it would not stop operations because it could not find any performance problems with the jet. Shortly after President Trump announced his decision, the FAA cited new satellite data and evidence from the crash scene that showed the flight path and behavior of the Ethiopian airline flights was very similar to the doomed Lion Air flight. Officials say more evidence is required to prove a conclusive link between the disasters, but until then, the planes will remain on the tarmac for the safety of travelers. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
The summit in Hanoi might have ended with no agreement, but America's top diplomat is hopeful that North Korea will follow through on its promise. Kim Yo-sun reports.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has expressed optimism North Korea will continue its current state of not conducting nuclear and missile tests. During an interview with Texas radio station KPRC2 on Wednesday, Pompeo also explained that the North's leader Kim Jong-un pledged during the Hanoi summit that his regime will not carry out further nuclear and missile tests. However, Pompeo also stressed the international society has to put pressure on the regime through sanctions to urge Kim to make the right strategic choice. Such a remark can be interpreted as a warning amid recent signs of increased activity at the regime's key missile launch site at Tongchangli. Pompeo also stressed there is still much work to do, adding the regime has not yet fulfilled the commitment Kim made to President Trump. Pompeo highlighted that denuclearization not only benefits the U.S., but the international community as a whole. Speaking with other media outlets in Texas, Pompeo also urged Kim to take action, reiterating that action is the only thing that counts. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
And for more, we have Dr. James Kim, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, joining me in the studio today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So the situation doesn't really seem in favor of North Korea. The U.S. keeps pushing for a big deal approach, and a new UN report sheds light on Pyongyang's evasion of sanctions. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reiterated on Wednesday that North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un promised not to conduct any further nuclear or missile tests, but at the same time he stresses that the international community has to put pressure on the regime through sanctions so that Kim makes the right strategic choice. Now, how do you see this increased pressure on Washington's part?
I think there's a broad consensus in Washington that the administration's approach to maintaining sanctions provided until North Korea denuclearizes there's a broad support for that. And, one way out of this is very easy. North Korea simply has to agree to denuclearize. Until North Korea changes its position on this, I think it'll be very hard for the U.S. to also make any concessions on their part.
You don't see any further imposing of sanctions, though?
There's a possibility that that could happen if North Korea decides to do something. As it was reported earlier, a potential test underway in Tongchangli. Or if North Korea decides to stall for much longer than the U.S. is willing to permit. So if this goes on for 3, 4, 5 months, we may see some action on the part of the United States to try to bring North Korea out of its shell.
So U.S. diplomats are meeting with key UN officials back-to-back to discuss the sanctions on North Korea. Now, Washington's Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, is scheduled to meet with the UN Security Council as well as key permanent representatives. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also met with the UN Secretary General on Wednesday to talk about the denuclearization issues. Do you think this is all along the same lines?
Well, it's possible that the U.S. is trying to send a signal to Pyongyang that it wants to have a tight grip on these sanctions, and it's working with the international community to try to make sure that there's no loosening of sanctions anywhere. But at the same time, there's been fairly consistent position that the United States has held. If you take Steve Biegun's statement at Stanford University before the Hanoi summit as an exception, U.S. policy on this has been fairly consistent prior to that. So I don't see this as any different than what the U.S. has said earlier and has reiterated after the Hanoi summit.
Do you see any action coming in response to the report that says that North Korea has been evading sanctions?
No, we knew that this was the case. It's just that the UN panel of experts report specifies exactly where these weaknesses are and the vulnerabilities may be in order to strengthen the sanctions regime, to try to bring more compliance into the sanctions. But overall, we knew that the sanctions regime is probably one of the toughest that North Korea has ever seen, and that with more time, there will be added pressure on the leadership in Pyongyang to do something about it.
And the U.S. State Department has also released its annual country's reports on human rights practices. Now, it's removed a key word in describing North Korea's human rights violations, the word egregious. Now, the report has also made no mention of the regime in its preface either, whereas in the past it said North Korea was labeled among the forces of instability. Why do you think so? Do you think it's to keep up the momentum for dialogue? It's
possible that the U.S. is signaling to Pyongyang that there are things outside of sanctions that it's willing to work with Pyongyang on. But at the same time, I think there was a statement by high-ranking official in the State Department which reiterated the U.S. State Department's position on this matter, and that it hasn't changed. So even though the report has, in content, somewhat shifted a bit, and that depends on the year-to-year when the report is released, but overall, I think the State Department's position has been fairly consistent on this issue.
Now, according to North Korea monitoring website 38 North, no new activity has been detected at the Sohae satellite launching station in Dongchangli. It says satellite image taken on March 8th indicates the construction on the engine support structure observed over the past few weeks has been complete. Now, how have you seen the North's intention of these developments?
It's unclear at the moment because there's no boot on the ground to be able to, verify what we're seeing in the satellite images. On the one hand, it's possible, as the State Department officials have reiterated, that North Korea has been engaged in this activity prior to Hanoi summit, so that the Hanoi summit really wasn't the catalyst for these changes. But on the other hand, it's also possible that North Korea may be signaling to the U.S. And trying to pressure Washington to maybe make some compromises on its position about sanctions and going with comprehensive approach to this negotiation and going towards a more an approach that North Korea favors, a phased, staged approach.
So can we say that it's still too early to consider it as a variable in the ongoing denuclearization?
Yeah, until North Korea actually takes some visible actions that really, would make Washington think twice about this issue, I don't think we want to jump too far ahead.
Now, a North Korean media outlet has urged the U.S. to accept Pyongyang's offer to dismantle its Yongbyon nuclear facilities in exchange for sanctions relief, saying that there's no better way than this. Now, it added that North's stance towards complete denuclearization remains firm. Now, if North Korea sticks to its position of phased denuclearization, how do you see the prospects for the denuclearization talks?
It's not easy, obviously, and the two sides need to address this issue and come to some sort of a negotiated solution about it. So there needs to be some talk about the talks. Because there's disagreement about the approach to how the two sides are going to move ahead on these negotiations, there needs to be some sort of an agreement about the approach. Otherwise, I don't see a way out here. And so either one of the two sides have to give in, and I don't know what's going to determine that. U.S. is obviously banking on the fact that sanctions will bring North Korea to change their position, but at the same time, I think North Korea is also trying to test the United States in different ways. So it'll be interesting in the next couple of months what the two sides do, if anything at all, to change the calculus on the other side.
Do you see any side making any concessions at this point, though?
Well, at the moment, I think the U.S. has signaled that anything outside of sanctions they're willing to talk about. And so it really depends on whether or not North Korea wants to talk about these other issues on the margins. But I think Hanoi summit made it very clear to everyone that Kim Jong-un was only interested in sanctions. Until there's a change in that position, it's difficult for me to see how they're going to get out of the impasse.
Now, amidst these developments, the South Korean government says it will facilitate or make efforts to facilitate North Korea-U.S. talks. Now, what do you see coming from Seoul's part?
Well, Seoul has suggested President Moon on one hand that he might try to convince the United States to come around on inter-Korean cooperation, but I think he's going to find that that's going to be very challenging. On the other hand, he really doesn't have much leverage vis-a-vis North Korea. So I don't know how he's going to position himself here to be a critical player to mediate this negotiation between the United States and North Korea. Maybe one way out of this is to work with other countries that are also important stakeholders here, including China, Russia, and Japan. But I'm not sure exactly how he would maneuver to do this in a multilateral framework, given that this is a bilateral negotiation between North Korea and the United States.
So do you think when he comes back from his overseas trip, there will be some engagement with the North?
He could try, but it really depends on whether or not the North Koreans are willing to sit down and talk to him about it.
Now, Seoul has somewhat moved away from its sanctions relief stance, though, with a senior ministry official saying that the resumption of tours to Mount Kumgangsan or the reopening of the joint Kaesong industrial complex is not something that they will move ahead hastily. Now, do you think Seoul has somewhat taken into consideration Washington's stance on the sanctions issue?
Yeah, this just confirms what we said earlier about this matter, that President Moon is going to find that he's going to be very challenged if he wants to try to get the United States to come around to his view about how to approach the negotiation with North Korea. That the U.S. has a fairly firm position on this, and until something changes here, I don't think he's going to be able to convince Washington one way or the other. His other approach, as I've said earlier, is to go to North Korea, but again, it depends on whether or not Kim Jong-un wants to talk about these issues with President Moon.
A South Korea and U.S. working group session is set to be held in Washington on Thursday now to coordinate various issues regarding North Korea's denuclearization. Now, Seoul's foreign ministry says the working group session will allow the two allies to assess what happened at the Hanoi summit, as well as see how North Korea and U.S. relations go from here. Now, the working group has been able to keep these dialogues on track until now, but do you think we can expect something like this time?
Well, everything depends on North Korea at the moment. U.S. has made very clear what its intentions are. It wants to continue the negotiation and the talks at the working level, and Steve Biegun has made that very clear and explicit. U.S. has also made its position clear about the conditions for that talk. Now, the question here is what's it going to take for Pyongyang to come out and say, yeah, let's go ahead with these discussions. So it's nothing that the working group can do bilaterally between U.S. and South Korea at the moment. What they could do is maybe perhaps work on some coordinated attempt about how to move forward with the negotiation if and when North Korea comes out of its shell and wants to talk about these matters.
So you don't see Washington taking a softer stance anytime soon?
Well, not at the moment. There's no indication that Washington's going to change its position on this. There are some potential sanctions bills that are being worked within the Senate and the House. So it'll be interesting whether or not these added pressure changes Pyongyang's thinking about this issue. But at the moment, there's nothing that suggests to me that Washington is going to change its stance on this.
Now, we're about 2 weeks since the summit fell through in Hanoi, and some U.S. experts have said that the talks should get back into track within a month. How do you see these views?
Again, it's very difficult for me to read the tea leaves on this because it's not clear to me where North Korea stands on this. And if North Korea continues to re-emphasize its desire for sanctions relief and a phased, staged approach. Maybe there's a way here that we can do something on a phased, staged approach that doesn't involve sanctions. But if it involves sanctions, I think they're going to find that it's going to be very difficult to convince the United States to come around to their view on this. So somebody has to change their mind. Otherwise, we may get a very, very slow-moving, if not stalled negotiations until 2020. And within the next few months, elections are starting in the United States. So once elections get underway, I think the president's going to be very distracted by domestic political issues in the United States. So it's not clear to me whether or not he can focus squarely on these kinds of foreign policy issues and whether he's going to want to invest more time in it. So there has to be some change here within the next 2 to 3 months, ideally. Otherwise, the U.S. will try to force the issue by bringing more pressure on North Korea.
Do you think North Korea has completed its analysis of the breakdown of the Hanoi summit?
I don't think so. I think they're still working to figure out what their next move is going to be. And it's going to be very interesting how they reposition, if at all. It's very possible that they decide to provocate in order to have a reset on the current situation and get them to be on the sort of position of strength But at the moment, U.S. is really has the position of strength on these negotiations, and it'll be interesting within the next couple of weeks. So we should watch very carefully.
Yeah, so we'll still have to wait for some positive developments. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Join us again tomorrow at the same time. But in the meantime, stay tuned to Arirang News for all the latest updates. Thank you for watching and goodbye.